MythVision. Welcome to MythVision Podcast. Today you're joining for a discussion / if you will, debate with Dr. Mark Goodacre and Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. To Q or not to Q? That is the synoptic question. and often we have what they call the synoptic problem. We're going to be discussing this problem today and how scholars handle this. There are various views. I'm going to jump right in. And right now, I'm going to show you guys our guest. We have Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, earned his undergraduate degree from Bob Jones University, a Master of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary, and a theology in Denver, Colorado. From 1980 to 1998. Since 1998 to 2015, he was the John Wesley Professor of the New Testament at the Claremont School of Theology and Professor of Religion at the Claremont Graduate University. He also was the Director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont. To list a few books, he has Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, Does the New Testament Imitate Mark?, The Gospels and Homer, Mythologizing Jesus, The Dionysian Gospel, Luke and Virgil, I'm not giving you guys subtitles, there's two, it would go on forever. Christianizing Homer, The Two Shipwrecked Gospels, The Legend and the Apostle, and from the earliest Gospel Q+, in the Gospel of Mark. We'll go ahead and start with our good friend here, Dr. Mark Goodacre. He is the Francis Hill Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University, right down the street from where I live, North Carolina, USA. He earned his master's in philosophy at the University of Oxford. His research interests include the Gospels, the Apocryphal New Testament, and the historical Jesus. Goodacre is the author of 4 books, including The Case Against Q, Studies in Marcan Priority, and the Synoptic Problem, and Thomas in the Gospels, The Case for Thomas's Familiarity with the Synoptics, which is going to be something we have to talk about in the future. He's well known for creating web resources on New Testament and Christian origins, including his podcast, The New Testament Podcast. Goodacre has acted as a consultant for several TV and radio programs, including The Passion, BBC, HBO, 2008, and Finding Jesus, CNN, 2015 through 2017. Goodacre is currently working on a book on John's knowledge of the Synoptic Gospels. Have you completed that book?
It needs a little bit more work.
Well, welcome, gentlemen, to the show. And obviously, thank you for taking up the opportunity to debate a question. I don't think there's going to be another Q video like this out there. So with that being said, I guess go ahead and start us off, Dr. MacDonald. We're going to let tenure in terms of age be the guy who starts us here. And I'm interested in hearing what you guys present about the Q gospel.
Thank you, Derek. Derek and Mark encouraged me to begin with an anecdote. I talked to a friend that I was going to have this interview with Mark Goodacre, and he said, "You must be a fool." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "How are you going to compete with someone who's younger, better looking, has a magnetic smile and an English accent?" And I think he's right. You know, I'm a fool to be here, but I really am glad to be here and to talk about the synoptic problem. So here we go. My primary interest in the Synoptic Gospels pertains to its imitations of classical Greek poetry, especially the Homeric epics, as I have argued in several publications, some of which Derek listed. In my opinion, the Synoptic problem will remain, to some extent at least, unsolved until such literary imitations become more widely recognized. But imitations of Greek poetry, even if acknowledged, can explain only synoptic characterizations, type scenes, and motifs. Once one removes these narrative features, one finds, especially in Matthew and Luke, a wealth of teachings, parables, and legal controversies that require a different explanation. The discussion between Mark Goodacre and me today pertains primarily to the so-called sayings traditions, whether it points to a lost gospel or not. To my knowledge, no one in his camp, which I will call the FAR hypothesis, though it's called by other things as well, has neither endorsed nor dismissed synoptic mimesis of Greek poetry. It would appear that they're content to largely ignore it. But mimesis criticism actually supports a major commitment to the Farr hypothesis, insofar as it leaves no doubt that Mark is the earliest of all surviving Gospels. On the other hand, it demonstrates that Luke must have received some of his materials not from Mark or Matthew, but from a lost Gospel, as we shall see. Now, let me say something about what seems to be the dominant solution to the synoptic problem, one that's different from Mark and myself, not the Gospel of Mark Goodacre and myself. That is the two-document hypothesis. And I'm going to be fair, but very brief. At the heart of the 2DH, or the two-document hypothesis, are three fundamental commitments. First, Marcan priority, with which I concur. Two, Matthew and Luke redacted Mark independently. Neither was aware of the other. Therefore, Matthew-Luke overlaps when they do not both rely on Mark, issue from a lost gospel, ergo Q from Quelle in German source. Three, Mark was ignorant of Q, as reconstructed by comparing Matthew and Luke. Now, here's how they go about reconstructing Q, and the most successful and popular of these reconstructions is what appears in the so-called critical edition of Q. First, one eliminates from Matthew and Luke everything that could be attributable to Mark. So you wash Mark out of Matthew and Luke. Second, you compare Matthew and Luke overlaps that remain for alternating primitivity and attributing every wording, early wording and sequencing to the lost gospel, on the notion that sometimes Mark is more primitive and other times Luke is. And then you assess content only in Matthew or Luke, the so-called Sondergut, special material, for content that's congruent with Q. Now, that's very simply put. Actually, the execution of these criteria on the synopsis can be very sophisticated and detailed. And I, for one, appreciate that hard work, though, as you'll see, I also differ from the conclusions, and especially the flawed methodology that is used to reconstruct Q. So that's what I would say is an overview of the two-document hypothesis. Mark, do you want to jump in here?
I'm quite happy listening to you all day, Dennis. I was very much enjoying that very, very lucid way of setting out the issues. Fantastic. And probably one of the most important things I can say for viewers is that I think the agreement, this is not a good way to start a debate, by the way, but I'm sorry, I'm going to do it anyway. But I suspect the agreement between me and Dennis is far, far greater than the disagreement. So I'm sorry, Derek, if that's a disappointing admission. So just the absolutely fundamental thing here, is Marcan priority. Dennis and I agree, like the majority of scholars, that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of something that resembles our Gospel of Mark. Not exactly the same, but it must have been along those lines. This is so fundamental to so much good historical scholarship on the Gospels. And I've referred to it in writing before as one of the crown jewels in biblical studies scholarship. It's just one of those things which has enabled historians to get a whole fresh light on historical Jesus, on the development of early Christianity. So that really fundamental thing we're agreed on. And I think one other thing that I'd want to sort of really underline really strongly, because this often gets missed, is that we are both strongly committed to a literary solution to this problem. That doesn't mean that there was only text. Obviously, these people talk to people as well, but a literary solution is absolutely clear. And the reason why I want to underline that and underline our agreement on that is that occasionally you'll hear people saying, oh, you've got 4 Gospels, there were kind of 4 people there. And, if I saw a traffic accident, I might, they have some things similar and some things different. That is just, I hate to say it, that's just so ignorant. That is just so ignorant, because what you have in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is fundamental, similar literary phenomena. And when I say similar, I mean, we're talking sometimes about entire paragraphs that are practically identical between Matthew and Mark, Mark and Luke, Matthew and Luke, and all three. And, I mean, it's so similar. So I think, if anything, that's probably the most important thing that I'd want to underline as things that we are fighting the same battle on, which is, this is a literary problem. And just to reiterate, that doesn't mean that there are not oral sources around and memory and different things. Obviously, all those things would have factored in. Most of those things are lost to us anyway, but it's a fundamentally literary phenomenon, and the importance of mark and priority. Then after that, I suppose we start disagreeing when we get to the specifics of how Matthew and Luke agree.
Well, let me play nice and say that there are two other places where I think we strongly agree. And I'm going to anticipate your book on the fourth gospel and the synoptics. And I am absolutely convinced that probably at several different layers of its composition, the Gospel of John knows the synoptics and knows more than one of them.
Right.
And it's almost risible to say that it's independent. So I would agree with that. I also think your work and that of others to show that the Gospel of Thomas, though it probably retains some independent Jesus tradition, knows the synoptics, and it knows more than one of them. So I do think that we agree on more with each other than we would disagree. But we do disagree on some things. So
great. So we can end it. So we can end it there, Derek. Then, right?
I was just going to say the debate is over, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys watching the show, and you saw now pick who won. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I'm glad you guys came on agreements, because it's important you find those areas. So when people are viewing like me, because I'm a student on every person I ever interview. I'm literally a student. I'm not a master at any of this stuff, and I'm going to be looking for where you disagree and why. I hope we touch on weeds, but don't get lost in the weeds as much as possible, because people like me will get lost literally and not be able to keep track of some of the things. But we do need to get into some stuff. So I don't want us to get too lost. With that being said, maybe we can start on... Well, Dr. MacDonald, I'll allow you to steer the boat on this, because I suspect we're going to start getting into where we need to focus on why you guys don't agree and what you view things different. How do you view things differently?
Well, I think we need to divide things into methodology on the one hand and evidence on the other. And I think Mark would agree with me that ultimately the answers are in the weeds. But the weeds do not make for good viewing on a podcast, on this kind of YouTube channel. So I do have some examples that we can use, but they illustrate the methodology. So I think what I'd like to do is to trot out what the Q plus Papias hypothesis is. And in order to do that, I apologize for having written something out. Just to be clear and to be concise. The Q plus Papias hypothesis derives its name from its advocacy of the existence of a lost gospel that is half again as long as the critical edition of Q, and also the theory's reliance on Papias' exposition, that is, his 5-volume work written around 110, significantly before the composition of Luke and John. Papias often appeals to information from an informant, the elder John, likely the same elder who wrote 1, 2, and 3 John. 2 citations are relevant to Mark and Matthew. Here's what he says, not about Mark Goodacre, but about the Gospel of Mark. And by the way, what I'm going to read to you now is the earliest known external reference to a synoptic gospel. Mark became Peter's translator. Whatever Peter recalled of what was said or done by the Lord, Mark wrote down accurately, though not in proper taxis, not in proper sequence. For Mark himself neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but as I said, he later followed Peter, who used to craft teachings for the needs of the occasion, not as though he were crafting a sequential arrangement, syntaxon, with the taxis is in there, of the logia about the Lord. So Mark was not in error by thus writing a few things as he remembered them, for he made it his one purpose to omit nothing that he had heard or falsely to present anything pertaining to them. Mark's taxis, or sequence of logia, that is pericope, accordingly need not be authoritative insofar as he merely translated into Greek a few things that he recalled of what Peter had remembered and taught without regard for proper sequence. Obviously, John had compared Mark's few things with a longer work or works that present logia in a different sequence. Few scholars today would concur that Mark relied on Peter's memoirs, and I have argued that most of his narratives derived instead from imitating Greek poetry, especially Homer. But Papias also says one very important but enigmatic sentence about Matthew. Matthew, according to Papias, John the Elder taught, Matthew set in order the logia in the Hebrew language, but each translated them, that is, these logia, as he was able. The expression "as he was able" intimates that each translator mishandled Matthew's Hebrew original and accurate taxis. John and Papias thus had a synoptic problem already by the year 110. Their three Greek Gospels contain similar logia, but in incompatible sequences. Insofar as the taxes of parallelogia in Mark and canonical Matthew are basically identical, the deviating sequence, in my view, likely appeared in the lost Greek Matthew. The importance of this passage should be obvious. Before the writing of the Gospel of Luke, the elder John and Papias knew three Greek collections of logia about Jesus. Presumably Mark and Matthew, perhaps as we know them today, but also one that is lost that resembled Matthew more than Mark, but with content in a different sequence, potentially something resembling what scholars have been calling Q. In other words, whether or not one holds to the existence of a lost gospel informing the synoptics, this reading of Papias modestly supports the two-document hypothesis against the far hypothesis, insofar as it requires admission that a lost gospel similar to Matthew existed prior to Luke. But of course, it does not show that it was the Q document that was known. That was the other Matthew. More important to me, actually, is what Papias has in common with Luke Acts. And this may come as a surprise to most people, maybe even to Mark. I think Luke is later than Papias and knows Papias. And because Papias was so concerned about Matthew, Luke had to have known Matthew. And this, I think, is the major problem with the two-document hypothesis. It has glossed over far too much evidence, not just minor agreements. By the way, a lot of the minor agreements are major agreements, and they need to be taken more seriously than they have been. Papias is thus more important in problematizing the two-document hypothesis than the far hypothesis. To tidy up his synoptic ataxia, that is a disorder, Papias set out to restore the taxis of Matthew's lost Hebrew collection in a syntaxis of his own to supplement it with other traditions and commentary. He says, I will not hesitate to set in order again, also for you, whatever I learned well and remembered well from the elders, with interpretations to confirm their reliability. For I would not take joy, as many would, in those who had much to say, but in those who taught the truth, not in those who remembered the commandments of others, but those who remembered the commandments given by the Lord for faith and derived from the truth itself. Now, the similarities between Papias's preface and the preface to Luke are extraordinary, because Luke modeled his after the exposition, in my view. Since many have attempted to set in order an exposition of the matters that have come to fruition among us, many have. And according to Papias, he had 3, 1 Mark and 2 Matthews. As though who became from the beginning first-hand observers, that is, like Peter and Matthew, according to Papias, and assistants of the word, like translators and Mark's transcription, handed on to us their expositions, it seemed good to me too, having followed them all thoroughly, to write an exposition precisely in sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may recognize the certainty of sayings about which you have been instructed. The parallel, end quotation, the parallels are even more striking in Greek. Nowhere in ancient prologues, nowhere does one find a compelling constellation of expositions, lexemes, and lukes. And I have these listed out in Greek. Most of your viewers will not appreciate the list, but it's 6 different expressions that the two have in common in Greek. Moreover, both books are addressed to a you, see. But my argument for Papias to Luke is not merely lexical, it also is topical. Both authors set out to correct the taxes of earlier Gospels, at least one of which was Mark. Insofar as Papias was obsessed with rearranging narratives about Jesus in his 3 Greek sources to Matthew's original order, and insofar as Luke seems to have known Papias, he obviously must have known Matthew as well. In my view, this is the decisive blow to the 2-document hypothesis as it's maintained. The comparison of the accounts of the death of Judas in the exposition and the Acts of the Apostle delivers the coup de grace. Papias's account disagrees with the account in Matthew, and Luke agrees with Papias, but shows awareness as well of Matthew's account. In other words, Matthew informed Papias's account, and Papias and Matthew influenced Luke's account. The arguments for this evolution of stories is compelling, but too complex for this discussion. In sum, Papias attests to the existence of a lost gospel that resembled Matthew, but with sayings in a different sequence. This could confirm the existence of Q in agreement with the 2-document hypothesis. On the other hand, if Luke knew Papias, he must also have known Matthew in agreement with the FAR hypothesis. The Q plus Papias hypothesis offers a compromise that advocates both the 2-document hypothesis in some regards, and the Q plus Papias hypothesis offers a compromise that advocates of the 2-document hypothesis and the FAR hypothesis both won't like. So, Mark, I do want to talk about how the 2 shipwreck gospels and this hypothesis go about reconstructing the lost gospel. But you may want to say something now about Papias.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So I don't have a nice prepared screed. I mean, I could. I've got my book. I could read a bit from the book, maybe. But no. To be fair, I don't discuss Papias much there. Maybe if I could just say one quick thing, because I'm interested in the interaction between us. But one quick thing I would want to say is that I like very much the stress on mimesis, imitation. And one of the things that I often say when I'm presenting this whole synoptic issue is, it's fascinating just how similar Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel are. In antiquity, you would struggle to find two books so similar. And to me, it's one of the great anomalies of scholarship that we take these two really similar books, the like of which, really, really similar books, and we say, oh, this guy didn't know this guy. There's no way that Luke got, his idea from Matthew. And to me, that's one of the most fundamental issues in this. And I think I like your quotation of the preface of Luke, Dennis, because one of the things the preface of Luke tells us is Luke is dissatisfied with his sources in some way. He does this whole thing, says, well, I've investigated everything carefully from the beginning, and now you're going to get the truth. And you don't write that way if all you're going to do is just copy out your source material. So Luke, I agree with you, Dennis. Luke is critical of his source material. It's just that in my way of looking at it is that emphasis on order that you have in Luke's preface really shows itself when you start noticing if Luke used Matthew, he really has reworked the order. I think he doesn't like Matthew's order. I think that's one of the key things that Luke's trying to do. And I think one of the fascinating things that you're seeing is, we agreed about Marcan priority, but one of the things I think Luke is doing is he has known Mark's gospel, I think, for much longer than he's known Matthew. And he's kind of got it into his bloodstream, into his thinking. He knows the thing really well. And I think when he reads Matthew's gospel, he can see what Matthew's gospel is. What Matthew's gospel is a revision of Mark. And I think Luke sees that and he thinks, do you know what? I could revise Mark too. And I think he thinks he could do it better. Not only because he has some sort of better ideas about the order, but also because he likes a lot of the new stuff in Matthew. And he says, well, I can use that. I like the Beatitudes. I like the Lord's Prayer. I like the parable of lost sheep. So those go in too. But he doesn't want to restructure Mark in the way that Matthew does. So I agree with lots of what you say there, Dennis. And I just one last thing. I like the point you made about minor agreements, and you said a lot of the minor agreements are quite major. The chapter I wrote about this in my case against Q actually is called Major and Minor Agreements, because one of the things that I think scholars have done is they basically, scholars are very good at categorizing things. I like to put everything into little boxes. And sometimes when they put things into little boxes, they do it to stop you from looking at it. They're like magicians sometimes. It's like a kind of sleight of hand thing. If you can take all the best evidence that Luke knew Matthew, and I think there's lots of it, there are thousands of these agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark. If you can take the best evidence and put it in a little box and label that box minor, then it gives every single student an excuse not to look in that box. And I think that's a fundamental mistake, because it might be that that box has got the key stuff in. I think it has, because if you want to argue that Luke knows Matthew's gospel as I do, then the best evidence for that is, where does Luke agree with Matthew? So we don't want to shunt that off, into the corner somewhere. We want to embrace it.
Well, I agree entirely. In fact, even though Goulder does not use the word mimesis, as I recall, he certainly, especially in his brilliant treatment of the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke, uses imitation and not what I would call anal redaction, which is so uncreative and buchstablich, literal. And we need to have a much more robust understanding of gospel intertextuality than the one that Alon and Huck Greven are promoting in their synopsis. By the way, I'm producing a new, what I call two mimetic synopses that include my reconstruction of Q, but for me, more significantly, my translations of parallels from Greek poetry. As a way of having a much more robust and wide open understanding of gospel intertextuality. So you might want to respond to my comment about Goulder, but Goulder had a much more creative understanding of gospel intertextuality than someone like Franz Neyrink.
Yeah, I mean, for viewers not familiar, this is Michael Golder. It was actually pronounced Golder as in shoulder.
Okay.
Michael Golder, I think one of the great scholars of our time on the Gospels, and sadly quite underrated during his lifetime. And he did see the evangelists as being creative authors. He felt that they were people who weren't just kind of village style scribes that were just barely cobbling their way through things, kind of a little bit muddled. We'll splice a bit of Mark in here and we'll splice a bit of Q in there. He thought that these were actual authors with creative minds who had agendas. Doesn't mean that their works are perfect literary art. The Gospels are not, they're not Homer, but they are, I think, products of brilliant authors with their own agendas. And yes, I think that Golder was absolutely right that when Luke starts writing his gospel, one of the first things he does is he says, okay, we've got these birth narratives in Matthew's gospel, adding a birth narrative at the beginning of Mark's account, great idea. I'm going to do the same, but I think I can do it better. And the thing about that is most of history has agreed with Luke on that because, I didn't, because of the pandemic, I didn't get back to the UK this holiday season, but usually I do. And that sometimes means that I'll get to a Christmas carol service. And do you know what? When you see people reenacting the Nativity, which one do they enact? It's always Luke. The only bit they like out of Matthew's is the three wise men, because that's them bringing presents, and then we can go, we can all give each other presents at Christmas, But otherwise, we like Luke. We like the shepherds. We like the angels. We like the Annunciation to Mary. We like the fact that Luke focuses on Mary rather than Joseph. So we're all in a way fans of Luke's project, which is why I think New Testament scholars are so strange when they say, "Oh my goodness, what's going on? Luke couldn't possibly have known Matthew's birth narrative." But why couldn't he? I mean, so yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
It was about time we agreed about something, Dennis. I'm getting really uneasy here.
Okay. Actually, the first thing I'm going to mention now, you'll agree with too, unfortunately, but I'll get to something you disagree with rather soon. I want to talk about my book, Two Shipwreck Gospels, The Logoi of Jesus, or Q+, and Papias' exposition of logia about the Lord. My solution to the synoptic problem begins with two fundamental commitments. The first, Mark, I think you'll agree with. The chronological sequence of synoptic writings begins with Mark, goes to Matthew, and finally Luke. And I think that's just got to be as fundamental as Marcan priority, that we get that sequence right. Two, sometimes later Gospels contain earlier material. That is, in many cases, Matthew preserves a saying found also in Mark, but with more primitive wording. In some cases, Luke preserves a saying found also in Mark or Matthew, but with more primitive wording. I call this phenomenon reversed priority. So whereas the two-document hypothesis uses alternating priority, I insist on reverse priority. And to identify it, I use three collaborating criteria. The first is independence likely is more primitive than narrative contextualization. When one version of a saying stands on its own, it generally takes priority to unassimilate it into a narrative context. Sometimes sayings generate narrative, in my view. Second, difficulty or ambiguity is earlier than improvement. Later texts tend to solve problems rather than create them, and to enhance Jesus' stature rather than diminish it, for example. Third, atypicalities versus typicalities. When one version of a saying displays characteristics typical of an author's style or theology, and there is a parallel version that lacks such editorial traits, the one that shows fewer of them likely is earlier. Now, Mark, you'll see similarities in these criteria for those that are used often for New Testament textual criticism. Moving to improvement, assessing a manuscript's typicality or whatever. Two Shipwreck Gospels first applies these criteria to Mark and Matthew, ignoring Luke, to show that even if Luke knew Matthew, which I think he did, one could make a case that Matthew had a second source, not just oral tradition, that contained content more primitive than Mark, and now is lost. Matthew's reverse priority is most apparent in his 18 doublets and 6 non-doublets. In each case, the non-Marcan version is more primitive. Now, this is very important to me, but it's hard to understand. So I want to very briefly try to help viewers understand what's at stake. Matthew redacts Mark. In 16 times, he has content that resembles his imitations, his redaction of Mark. And in every case, apparently, the non-Marcan version is more primitive. Non-doublets refer to places where Matthew has been redacting Mark. We get to a certain point and he stops redacting Mark, but that content appears elsewhere in the gospel, not with Marcan wording, but with wording that's more primitive. Now, scholars routinely attribute these more primitive non-Marcan doublets and non-doublets to Matthew's knowledge of alternating sayings from oral tradition. But the logia isolated from Matthew's reverse priority to Mark repeatedly imitate Deuteronomy to portray Jesus as the promised prophet like Moses. And you can see this, of course, in Matthew already still, where there's this concern about Jesus as the new Matthew and the new Torah. But in my reconstruction of these primitive non-Marcan materials, we find John the Baptist in the wilderness preaching repentance like Moses in the first verse of Deuteronomy. John insists that he's not a prophet like Moses, someone stronger than he is coming. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness for 40 days like Moses on Mount Sinai, and in response to the devil, he cites Deuteronomy 3 times. He overturns the Mosaic permission for a man to divorce his wife. He violates Torah by eating with tax collectors and sitters, by defending, gleaning, and healing on the Sabbath, and eating with unwashed hands. In the last logion, Jesus promises his 12 disciples thrones in his kingdom from which to judge the 12 tribes of the house of Israel, much as Moses had authorized a judge for each of the 12 tribes at the end of Deuteronomy. The consistency of this theme in these materials, including verbatim citations from Deuteronomy, points not to Matthew's awareness of oral tradition, but to a document in addition to and earlier than Mark. Then my book applies the same materials to the Gospel of Luke to identify reverse priority to not just Matthew, but also reverse priority to Mark. And there again, we have about, I think, 14 doublets and 8 non-doublets. So basically, that's my attempt to reconstruct the lost gospel.
Dr. MacDonald, if you don't mind, I think this is really important because there's a lot of layers you added to this in terms of what we're going to discuss. And I definitely think it's important. Can we pause where you're at and get Dr. Goodacre to maybe respond? Because some of these I think he's going to disagree with. And I'd like to see some interaction here for the sake of the audience as well, so they could see both of you guys kind of discuss some of this stuff, because there's a lot already you mentioned there that could really be talked about. And some of those things, I guess I want to ask a few basic things, if that's okay, to you, Dr. Goodacre, and then we can get
I just want to read one final paragraph.
Please.
But I agree. I want to get right to Mark's comments.
Yes.
Both dominating solutions to the synoptic problem propose that Luke had only 2 sources, although that I know is not entirely fair. According to the 2 document hypothesis, the 2 were Mark and Q. According to some versions of the Farah hypothesis, they were Mark and Matthew. But already Papias knew of 3 lost gospels, and Luke speaks of many previous attempts to write an exposition. 2 measly sources do not constitute many. The Q plus Papias hypothesis, however, insists that Luke's many included Mark, Matthew, a lost gospel resembling Matthew, which I would call Q plus, or the logo of Jesus, and Papias's exposition. In other words, 4 makes many, 2 does not make many. And then I'm done. Okay.
That's a great point. Quick questions, just real quick ones, and then I want to discuss. This is the heart, right? We're right at the beating heart of the differences between you and Dr. MacDonald. First question I have for you, Dr. Goodacre, that I think is important, and then I want to allow you guys free conversation. I don't want to intrude because you guys are going to get much further than I will be able to bring you guys to in this debate. Dr. Goodacre, do you agree, and this is a side note, on Dr. MacDonald's view of the Homeric connections mimetically to Mark? Yes or no? You don't have to go into too much if you want. I mean, you know.
I think it's really intriguing and exciting. And actually, the nice thing about Dennis's work on Homer and the Gospel of Mark is that you can accept that or reject it on a range of different explanations of gospel relations. And I think one of the things it's helped us to do is sometimes we, in sort of 21st century scholarship, we insist that you can only bring out any parallels if they're parallels within Second Temple Judaism. We are so obsessed now with that, so that we sort of picture the evangelists as being, I mean, this was a corrective to earlier scholarship where basically they really said, oh, no, we don't want any kind of Second Temple Jewish stuff. So I think one of the things that's very helpful about Dennis's work is it helps us to think about the entire Greco-Roman literary context that everybody in this period was moving in. So that's something I'm very grateful for.
Well said. He didn't say yes, he agreed completely. I do appreciate the compliment, and that was wonderful. Let's see. What about his views on Papias as a source? In the Farrer hypothesis, what it sounded like to me is Dr. MacDonald is suggesting technically we have another gospel, 2 Matthews, and the second Matthew that we don't know of is technically his Q source. But I don't know if that's already bringing into some of the weeds that he's brought up about reverse priority, that kind of stuff.
I agree that we need to take Papias seriously, and one of the things that's fascinating about Papias is that the quotations we have for people that don't know Papias, we don't actually have his stuff. So we're dependent on some quotations that turn up in Eusebius from a couple of hundred years later. And what is really interesting about Eusebius's quotations is he's got this big chunky bit on Mark, which Professor MacDonald quoted. But then when he gets to Matthew, it's just like this sentence or so. And that does suggest to me that we are in an era where Mark's gospel is still regarded as really, really important and pivotal, because as you move later into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Mark is getting marginalized all the time. So that I find really interesting. But I do want to say on the back of that I don't doubt the existence of, or the possibility of the existence of, other sources, other literary sources, possibly even other lost gospels. Where I'm skeptical is I'm skeptical of our ability as scholars to reconstruct them. This is where I'm uncertain. See, the thing is, everywhere you look in New Testament criticism, scholars are busy trying to reconstruct sources. And I always find that work interesting, but I'm just skeptical. I'm not skeptical about the existence of those texts in antiquity. I'm skeptical about my colleagues' ability to, tease them out. Because I think one of the problems is we're all, in a sense, frustrated archaeologists. We like the idea that an archaeologist can go and dig in the dirt and they can pull some artifact out and then say, look what I've found. We want to do that when we're looking at our text. But the thing is, however hard, I've got my Greek New Testament here, however hard I dig around in there, I am not going to be able to pull out an ancient source precisely in the same way an archaeologist can pull something out of the ground. So, that's where my worry is. I just think that I don't think that literary remains are like archaeological sites. So that's where I'm kind of skeptical, and especially given that we actually do have something that appropriates to Matthew's gospel, something that we haven't got Matthew's original autograph or Luke's or anything like that, but we've got lots of early witnesses to that stuff. And then when we look at Matthew and Luke alongside one another, it's just so much easier to draw a direct line, it seems to me, rather than to do this kind of independent, kind of thing that there must have been something else that was out there that we can't, that we've no longer got access to.
So to be technical here, where I see a lot of issues is trying to draw off of a source that is technically prior to Mark, as if there's some prior to Mark that Mark's using this gospel as a lost source. Who knows if there was a floating source simultaneously to these, but that Mark in priority, when you say that, you mean that it was the initial gospel, so to speak. Whereas what Dr. Goodacre or Dr. Price, I always interview Dr. Price, Dr. MacDonald is suggesting is that there was actually a gospel source being used by Mark that might have been a primitive gospel that was, if you will, the priority, and then Mark became, I think, more well-known. So you guys are in a little bit of a disagreement on that issue. I like what you said about being skeptic. Can we really get a fossil out of this? And you're not so sure. You might get a fossil that you want to see or suspect based on certain evidence and methodology and how you're approaching the topic. Let me ask one more thing, and then I'll shut up. Because he touched on a lot of good things I had to make notes on. Primitive priority. So if he is correct in saying Luke's using older, it sounds like Luke is saying things that sound older than Matthew or Mark. Right there, that would be the doors opening to say, well, where is he getting that older phrase from if Mark or Luke or Mark and Matthew don't sound older? What do you have to say about that and his methodology on coming to those conclusions?
Yeah, this is, I think it's a mirage. So one of the reasons why Luke sometimes looks more primitive is that Luke's just got a much bigger vocabulary. He's got a huge vocabulary. So whereas, Matthew will say, talk about moving mountains, Luke will talk about moving a sycamore tree, right? Or when Matthew will talk about the birds of the air, consider the birds of the air. Luke says, don't birds, ravens. Consider the ravens of the air. This is all the way through Luke. And this isn't just in the so-called Q material. This isn't the way he edits Mark as well. When he's editing Mark, he introduces more unusual expressions into Mark than he takes over. So you can look more primitive if you're just coming up with a phrase just sort of once. So that's one of the reasons why Luke often looks more primitive. And it's also that Matthew's got a very clear, predictable style. So it's very easy to spot. But Luke's style is often so much more subtle. And I think it's easy to mistake subtlety for primitivity. And another thing that is that sometimes there are just extremely good arguments for Luke's redaction of Matthew that have been ignored. So one of them, the absolute classic, this is the textbook one. This is not me just pulling some random thing out. The textbook example is the first beatitude in Luke 6, verse 20. In Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit. In Luke 6:20, blessed are the poor. Everybody, every single Q scholar, practically without fail, says Q had blessed are the poor, and Matthew spiritualized it, added in spirit. So I argued in my book, what would you expect Luke to do if he had Matthew? What you'd expect him to do is write blessed are the poor, because we have an earlier sermon in Luke. It begins in Luke 4:16. What does he do? Jesus says that the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. Right? I mean, that's the previous sermon in Luke, the poor. And so I point this out, and people go, "Oh yeah, I suppose it could be that." But then I still think Matthew spiritualized it. So I say, well, look even earlier in Luke, look at the Magnificat, Mary's song, where what she talks about is this massive eschatological reversal where the poor will become rich and the rich will become poor and the humble will be raised up. That's the Beatitude. You look later in Luke, you look at the story of the rich man in Lazarus, where the rich man is the one who goes to Hades and the poor man is the one who is exalted, just as Luke has in 6:20. So sometimes I think it's just a case that there are really good arguments for Lucan's secondariness that are overlooked, in part because I think of our secularizing gospel. Lots of us are secular types. So we kind of prefer something that says blessed are the poor to something that says blessed are the poor in spirit, because we don't really know what poor in spirit means. So I think that would be my, in a nutshell, kind of answer. I think mainly greater Lucan primitivity is a sort of mirage. It's not really there.
Okay, Dr. MacDonald, I know you want to respond to that, and I would love to have you respond to that, and then I'd like to have Dr. Goodacre, if you don't mind, to take over in terms of leading the discussion so that you and him can have an open back and forth. And I don't want to have to coerce the conversation, so to speak. I'd allow you guys to freely, even get into the weeds, like this specific example. I'd like to hear you guys read in differences and stuff, or other examples, and go from there.
Well, I'm going to respond to two different pieces of Mark's response to you, Derek. The first is to say that I share his skepticism about the ability to reconstruct the lost gospel Q. I've done my best to do so, but I would be the first to say that my reconstruction of Q is not a xerographic copy of the lost gospel. It's built on explicit criteria. I trust that I applied the criteria fairly and consistently, and that I think I've unearthed not the ipsissima verba of the Q document, but the ipsissima vox, if I could put it that way, an authentic voice that is distinctive, that underlies the Gospels of all three synoptic Gospels. But I share your skepticism. In fact, the reason that I developed the Q plus Papias hypothesis is, I was director of the Institute for Antiquity of Christianity here at Claremont, which is a center of Q scholarship. John Kloppenborg is a friend of mine. I was a colleague of James Robinson. So now I'm, of course, persona non grata to that crowd. But I tried to make the critical edition of Q work for me with those criteria, and it failed. And it failed not only in the ways I've talked about, but there are other lots of examples where the methodology fell apart and I just couldn't go there. So it's one thing to be skeptical. It's another to say, then should we abandon the project or should we try another project? And so I've decided on another project, and I think your skepticism is more thoroughgoing, but I think it's legitimate. And to some extent, I share it. I do disagree with you about the Beatitudes. I don't want to go there, but what I would, and by the way, I do agree with you that some of Lucan creativity is overlooked in an overly literal way of understanding intertextuality. So that Luke has taken liberties with Matthew that we often have not seen and factored into an assessment of whether we actually have inverted priority of Luke against Matthew. I grant you that. I don't think, though, that your solution answers the places where Luke has more consistent sequencing than Matthew. It's not just a matter of his clever language, and I agree with that. It's not just a matter of mimesis versus redaction. It's also an issue of arrangement. And of course, arrangement was a big deal for Luke and Papias, and it's a big one for me. The example I wanted to give everybody was an issue related to sequencing. So I don't want to get into it now. I don't think we have the time. It would be right in the weeds that we don't want to go into. But so my answer I share your skepticism about the ability to reconstruct the document. I don't think my document is a copy. I would never call it a critical edition of Q, for example, which is a rather preposterous pretension on the part of the international Q community, in my view. I agree that Lucan creativity needs to be taken seriously in assessing the relationship between Luke and Matthew. I don't think It's just a matter of literary competence. I think there are issues of sequencing and real primitivity going on. So I think I'll just leave my comments there.
Time to put the boxing gloves on, guys. Dr. Goodacre.
Yeah, I'm always amused by this concept of getting into the weeds as being a bad thing. I mean, I have a couple of attitudes to the weeds. I mean, one of them is that if I see weeds on my lawn, I want to pull them out and throw them away. But if I suppose the other attitude is I want to understand them. And I think that to go back to archaeological metaphors again, I use a phrase in my Thomas book, which I picked up from a grad student of mine, Ken Olson, diagnostic shards. Because when an archaeologist gets a pot out of the ground, gets a bit of a pot, a lot of the pot isn't going to actually help you date it. You know, you might get just a bit that turns out to be a bit of the side of the pot. But if you get like maybe a bit of a handle and a bit of the top, that can be a diagnostic shard because it can help you say, oh, Roman era pottery. And then you know you're in a Roman era tomb rather than, say, a Byzantine era tomb or something like that. And my feeling is that sometimes when you do look at the details in the synoptics, some of them are like those diagnostic shards in archaeology because there's just stuff in Luke that shouldn't be there if he hasn't got Matthew's gospel and if he's not dependent on Matthew. I mean, I mentioned a minute ago the first sermon in Luke, which is like the rejection at Nazareth, which Luke brings forward from where it is in Mark chapter 6. In Mark, you've got the rejection at Nazareth in chapter 6. He doesn't call it Nazareth, he calls it Jesus' home place, his home country, whatever. But Luke brings this forward, and you think, well, why did he bring it forward? And then you look at Matthew's gospel, Matthew 4:13, he mentions Jesus leaving Nazareth. And not only that, he spells it. This is really the weeds. He spells it Nazarah. And Luke spells it Nazarah in Luke 4:16 as well. And you think, well, that's pretty striking, isn't it? So suddenly we have this agreement. It's a tiny agreement, but but sometimes, you know, minor agreements make major contributions to the debate. And I just think it's the accumulation of things like that just make me say on time and time again, I think Luke's working with Matthew. And if I may sort of like turn it back to you, Dennis, one of the difficulties I think for me about your position is that you're happy to admit that Luke knows Matthew, but then you have to imagine that Luke's put Matthew, I don't know, where is Matthew? Is it sort of in the closet somewhere? It's certainly on the floor. It's not, you know, it's not on his lap, is it? Or, I mean, so where's Luke left Matthew? Why is Luke so busy with Q+ when he's got this lovely gospel, which became extremely popular in the 2nd and 3rd centuries? But Luke, he's left it out the back somewhere, hasn't he?
Well, we're going to get in the weeds, and I think that's good. Okay. You're familiar with Darren Backer's book on gospel composition and so on. I think it's important, especially how many different visual accesses an ancient author can have to sources. So in some cases, it's visual access. Both of us agree with that. In some cases, it's freer and it's not so buchstablich, and you'd agree with that. Some cases, it may in fact be by memory. So that my assessment, let's say, of Luke is that sometimes he has an actual text in front of him. I think that's the case usually with Mark. I also think sometimes he may have Matthew's text in front of him, but may only have remembered that Matthew had an alternative version or whatever. I'm not sure of the technology of it, honestly. But here's something that I find fascinating and am perfectly willing to back down from, but I find to be quite interesting. In my view, the parallels between Papias and Luke appear primarily in the preface and in the Acts of the Apostles. That is, the bookends of Luke's project. Inside of that, his imitations of Matthew, in my view, occur next after Papias. After the introduction, you get the infancy narrative. And then before you get to the Acts of the Apostles, you get to the resurrection stories that have occasionally their own echoes between Luke and Matthew.
That's right.
Then you get to, so we're building a chiasm. The next material that we find is the Marcan material from John the Baptist until about the first Passion prediction. And then we have the Lucan travel narrative, which is a big section in the middle where we don't have very many parallels to Mark and even to Matthew. And then we pick up the Marcan narrative again at about 1854 and carry the Marcan pattern up until we get to the resurrection story. In other words, I just find it fascinating that in terms of technology, he has Papias first and last. Then he has Matthew second and second to last. Then he has the Marcan narratives between the Matthean sandwiches, and he finds this then big travel section that has, according to the two document hypothesis and my own too, most of the Q material, or at least the special Lucan material, tends to be in that central section. So I think your question is right on target, Mark. And I think this is one of the unknown, the places where the synoptic scholars have to continue to work. That is, what is the technology of composition? Mm-hmm. When does an author have a text in front of him? Can authors have more than one text in front of them? Because sometimes they also have a biblical text in front of them. Mm-hmm. And in my view, sometimes a poetic Greek text in front of them. Do they remember these things? Darren Bacher talks about strategic readings of a text before composition, so you saturate it the same way the ancient rhetoricians would talk about a cow rechewing cud after it's already had it in the stomach. So I do think that these questions are important. I don't know that they're answerable. And so my attitude would be to be really flexible on the technology of composition. How many texts are available? Do people remember it? Or in some cases, the parallels, in fact, may come from oral tradition, but we just can't monitor it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if I may, I'll pitch in on the technology issue. I think it's actually fascinating to ask the media question. How the heck was Luke doing this, whatever the hypothesis was? And I mean, the book that you mentioned, Robert Derenbacher's Ancient Compositional Practices and the Synoptic Problem, really, really important contribution to the debate. But one thing that I'm actually I hope at some point going to write on this is I think that one thing that's been missed in the debate is how ancient authors generally worked. And they generally, when they talk about writing, they don't mean, you see, when we say writing, so I've got a pen in my hand at the moment. When we say writing, we mean both composition and physically scribing. But somebody like Cicero, when he says writing, what he means is he means composing and somebody else is doing the scribing. And I think Luke's like that. I think Luke's like Cicero. I think that Luke has got his own, I call his scribe, Paul had a scribe called Tertius, who comes in Romans 16. So I like to imagine that Tertius's nephew, Quartus, is the person who actually writes down Luke's gospel. Now, if you've got someone else, and this is the norm in antiquity, this isn't just like some wacky idea I've come up with. This is the norm. Everybody is dictating. Authors are dictating in antiquity. Now, if Luke is dictating, we can get rid from our mind of all of these ideas of Luke being in a tangle, because he's got Matthew here and Mark here, and then a pen here and a sponge here and something to scrape the thing with here. What he's got is he's got the scroll in his hands. So he can actually, when he needs to, actually open the scroll and read from it directly out loud. And I think that's what's going on sometimes in this really, really high verbatim passages where Luke seems to be almost like reading it out. And I think like when you get something like the sign of Jonah in Matthew and Luke, it's so similar. Or John the Baptist preaching, which you mentioned, Dennis. I mean, it's so similar in Matthew and Luke. I think Luke's reading it out of Matthew, but I appreciate the mention of memory as well. Memory is so important, and memory of manuscript is important. This is just a theory, can't prove this, but I think that Luke has Mark's gospel almost by heart. And we know that you can memorize Mark's gospel because plenty of people have done it. You can go on YouTube and you can watch Tom Boomersheim performing bits of Mark in Greek from memory. You know, I mean, so I think that's what's going on in Luke. And I think it's a kind of a melding of these things. There's no one explanation that meets them all. But I think the idea that Luke technologically couldn't have done what he's supposed to have done on the basis of his knowledge of Matthew, I think is not right at all. I think it's quite easy to imagine him doing that thing by memory and dictation and just consulting the text in front of him.
I want to jump in on the question of genre and literary. Oh, I know there was another issue I wanted to raise. Sorry. Yeah, Richard Carrier and I had a debate recently, and he denies, of course, that Jesus existed. You and I agree that he must have existed. But one of the things that and I don't think I'm putting things in your mouth, that one of the issues that the viewers had was if there's no Q document, then the earliest manifestation we have of Jesus as with some of these sayings is not until about 180, 185, whenever we date Matthew. And so many people argued that how could I...
Not 180, sorry to interrupt, but not 180, you mean 80?
80, no, 80, yeah. 80 or 85, yeah.
I thought there's a radical new dating going on.
The one advantage of the Q hypothesis, I would date the Q document around 60. We get 25 years head start on Matthew with some of that. And so that's one reason I'm interested in the Q document. But let me come back to this issue of technology and the gospel genre. I think there is so much confusion about the gospel genre, and it comes in part because of my interest in Greek poetry and mimicist. But it also comes out of my own study of Greek rhetoricians, and I've spent quite a bit of time dealing with Quintilian and other Horace and so on in the rhetorical letters. And one of the things that they especially Quintilian says, is if you want to know how to write a poem, you read poetry. It's not that you have poetry that you can list out the genre requirements for poetry. It's that you're familiar with that text. And I think that Luke is writing a gospel, not because he has an idea of what a gospel should be, but because he has literary models that already have done what he wants to do, and he's rewriting it. So a lot of this verbiage, and I'm thinking about Burge and others here, about what constitutes a gospel genre, I think is wrong, bad thinking. I don't think it's generic. I think it's genetic, that you have gospels because they're rewriting each other. And you can see that they're rewriting each other even when they have such different genres, such as the Gospel of Thomas, for example. So I think this discussion of technologies of writing and so on needs to take rhetorical traditions pretty seriously. And I think we don't know enough about how compositions worked in antiquity to be able to simply use a simple source redaction model for explaining intertextuality.
Dr. Goodacre?
Yeah, I don't disagree. Don't disagree with anything there.
Let me ask you something then. Let's go back to the technology sandwich analogy, or the chiastic structure that Dr. MacDonald brought up about Papias. I want to ask you and get your comments. Do you think Luke's using Papias?
No, absolutely not. No.
Okay, so there's a disagreement. Okay, cool.
Oh yeah.
So punches were thrown.
I think. So in terms of dating, I am pretty sure that Luke knows Josephus. Well, I'm absolutely sure Luke knows Josephus. That means that Luke has to post-date 90. Steve Mason makes such a good argument for that.
I agree.
But also, I think Ignatius knows Luke. Now, Ignatius is really difficult to date, but Ignatius's Smyrnians, it really looks like he is quoting bits of Luke, and I could make a case for that. But that actually means that your window for Luke's gospel is somewhere between the late 90s and 120, 130, the absolute latest, because then we get to Gospel of Thomas, which I argue my book also knows Luke. So I suspect that Papias either did talk about Luke and we haven't got it. Eusebius doesn't quote it, maybe because it's not significant or interesting enough, or Papias could be a near contemporary and Luke is relatively recent. You have a similar phenomenon in the Gospel of Thomas, where in the Gospel of Thomas 13 you have reference to Peter, who was already by this stage, like in Papias, seen as the source of Mark, and you have a reference to Matthew. And so this sort of Mark-Matthew thing, Peter-Matthew thing is a kind of an early 2nd century way of thinking about these things. But I mean that would be my speculation. But no, I don't think that Luke knew Papias. And I do agree with Professor MacDonald that there are fascinating similarities between Luke's preface and the way that Papias speaks, and especially the stress on order. And I think that might be influenced by Luke. I can't prove that, but it might be influenced by Luke's preface. Luke's the first one we know of to complain about order. And then after that, for the next 1900 years, everyone's worried about order. But Luke, I think, is first, and then Papias, and then everybody else is going, oh my goodness, why is Luke got this bit here? And, and then you go to John's gospel, oh my goodness, the cleansing of the temples at the beginning of the gospel. Why is that there? So as soon as you have competing canonical text, you're always going to have that problem of order.
When would you date Papias's exposition, Mark?
I don't know. I'm waiting for. There's a book in press at the moment by Stephen Carlson from Australian Catholic University. Really looking forward to seeing what he says. So I'm going to reserve judgment in case I say something rash that I'll have to repent.
Well, I'm going to say something rash, and then I may have to repent because I'm looking forward to that document too. But Ulrich Kirtner and Noreki Norelli are the two that I use. Right. And they date Papias around 110. Mm-hmm. And I would date Luke around 115, which does allow then for a relative chronology that would favor.
Right.
But
so we're very close on that as well then.
But to be honest, the relative dating is in flux both for Luke, Acts, and for Papias. So one has to make the argument in terms of literary direction and not solely as a matter of relative chronology. I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, to the sandwich of the chiastic structure that we were talking about in Luke, something came to mind, and I thought to myself, okay, Luke is definitely using higher vocabulary. He has I guess you'd say a stronger vocabulary to come up with a better imagination. Plus, these are authors; they're creative in their own way. They could be using their own imagination while creating these texts, and possibly influenced by, like you talk about, Dr. MacDonald, other works that might even be like the Dionysian narratives or other such potential Greek narratives that may play a role. But I wanted to ask, in the sandwich, in the middle, when we get past Papias, if we assume that that's accurate, that's Papias, we get past Matthew and we assume that everything there is connecting from using Matthew as a source. We get past or into the Mark area. That's where the gray area started to come up in that little chiastic thing that I was thinking. I was trying to read your mind, Mark, and wonder what you were thinking. Well, that's where you're saying Q plays some type of role in a way in that middle area where Mark is at in Luke. Whereas you would say, no, this is the only sources needed technically gospel-wise that we have is Matthew and Mark. I guess my question to you, and maybe you can expound on that and just give some ideas, and then Dr. MacDonald can piggyback, is the way I see it is there's either text source or oral tradition is usually like the cop-out for explaining why something's there. Text source obviously would be far, and not saying that there may not have been an oral tradition, but that's like reconstructing Q, so to speak, supposing something's there that we don't know for a fact or don't have evidence of. Can you elaborate some into Luke, into the heart of where we're at here and what you're saying and how you disagree with?
I mean, on chiasms, I'm a chiasm skeptic.
I am too, as a matter of fact. I am.
I just don't. You see, the thing is, it's one of those things where they're self deconstructing in the sense that for every chiastic structure that you find, you will find another person pushing equally hard for a different chiastic structure, which basically kind of is self-refuting. And I long ago, before I decided to write my doctoral thesis on the work of Michael Golder, one of the things I was thinking about doing was writing them on chiasms, and I'd come up with a method for attempting to refute the existence of scholarly reconstructions of chiasm. But everyone that I pitched it to said, well, we don't believe in those chiasms anyway. So anyway, I abandoned doing that. I do want to, on the oral tradition point, I think that's right. I think for me, there are two things involved in the oral tradition issue. One is, of course, people talk to one another. That's really what oral tradition means. We know that there was oral tradition. If you read Paul's letters, you know that he's talking to people, other Christians are talking to each other. The difficulty with the appeal to oral tradition is it's often used in scholarship to try and, as a kind of get out of jail free card. And one thing I would say about oral tradition in the Gospels is that there are only two places that I can think of where you've got an explicit tradition that is mentioned orally. One is in Matthew 28, when there's said to be a tradition about the disciples stealing Jesus's body. And Matthew thinks that this tradition is unreliable. So that's one vote against oral tradition from the author of Matthew. The other one is at the end of John's Gospel, when there's a tradition that goes around that the beloved disciple will never die. And then the author of this book says, well, no, that's not really what Jesus said either. So the two times you actually get oral tradition coming up in the Gospels, they're quickly followed by the evangelist going, oh, no, but we don't like oral tradition. So actually, the evangelists, what they really liked was it is written, not only when it comes to Old Testament texts and so on, but also when it comes, I think, to prior Christian sources.
Dr. MacDonald, I tell you what, I would like to hear, for our audience that's watched so far, we've heard mostly agreement in this entire debate. Let me ask Dr. Goodacre to follow up on this real quick, Dr. MacDonald, because I'd like to have you comment on this. Dr. Goodacre, from your perception, and based on what you've heard so far, what are your problems? Like, can you tackle what you think are the heart of the issues and really like lay them out, and then maybe make a comment and we can have Dr. MacDonald bounce back on that?
Sure. I suppose the key thing for me would be Occam's razor. Occam was a medieval philosopher who said that sometimes Occam is misrepresented as saying the simplest hypothesis is the best, but that's not actually what he said, because that would be a ludicrous thing to say, because simple hypotheses are frequently wrong. But what he did say is you shouldn't multiply entities beyond what's necessary. So my key point would be that if you can make good sense of Luke's gospel on the basis of him having used Matthew and Mark, then there isn't any need to go to Q plus, proto-Luke, special this, special that. You just look at the documents you've got in front of you. And so I think that's the fundamental thing for me. Luke makes such good sense as a reworking of Matthew in the light of his frequent preference for Mark. So I think if I wanted to get to the nub of it, that's the one for me. That's the really key thing. It's our good friend, William of Ockham.
Dr. MacDonald.
My screen is frozen. So I'd be happy to respond, and I'm not falling asleep or checking out. But I think Mark has identified exactly where the primary disagreement would be. And what I would say is Occam's razor isn't sufficient to explain all of the places where I think Luke is more primitive than Matthew. And you mentioned the Beatitudes, but there are many other examples that people have given. And by the way, you and other members, advocates of the FAR hypothesis, have spent a lot of time worrying about them and writing about them. So I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, if I could use an English expression. But the Beelzebul controversy, the Lord's Prayer, prohibition of divorce, judgment on Jerusalem, hating one's family, then I would add the issues of sequencing. I just don't think you can get a free pass on all of the places where Luke differs from Matthew, but Luke seems to be more primitive. The other is I'd be fascinated in knowing what you do with Matthean doublets especially, but also Lucan doublets and non-doublets. Because the nice thing about having a second source is it allows to see how doubling up works. But Occam's razor is not very good at explaining doublets and non-doublets, in my opinion. So I think, Derek, you were right in asking us where the big disagreement is. And I think that's where it is. Whether literary creativity on the part of Luke is sufficient to explain the deviations from Matthew, or whether it requires another document. And I would add the issue of doublets and non-doublets to it. So I think that is the major point of disagreement.
Dr. Goodacre, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, the doublets one is interesting. I mean, of course, Luke does have a second source, in my view, which is Matthew. So the question then is Matthew, because there's Matthean doublets as well, is Matthew capable of creating doublets on his own? Yeah, of course he is. And not just doublets, but triplets and quadruplets, because what happens with many ancient authors is there's going to be a particular kind of saying that they like and they reuse. So go to the Gospel of Thomas. He really, really likes a saying that he finds in the Synoptics, let the one who has ears hear, right? And in Thomas, it comes multiple times. And we don't go, well, he must have had like 4 or 5 sources for that. You know, we just say, oh, he really likes the one who has it, the one who has ears to hear. So a parallel example in Matthew would be something like weeping and gnashing of teeth, which Matthew uses 5 times in his gospel. He loves that phrase. Luke uses it just the once. Does Matthew have 5 different places where he gets it from? No, it's just a phrase that he likes. So yes, the evangelists all will double up sometimes when there's something that they particularly like, and with something they really like, you'll get it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, or even more often. You know, I mean, that's just endemic, I think, across the Synoptics and even in other early Christian documents, where the human mind is a strange thing. There are certain things that you will latch onto and your brain will just keep bringing back. And that's why I think, you know, you get this kind of repetitious material. And also, and the other thing about the Matthean doublets, it's really interesting, is that I think Matthew's a better poet than Mark, and than Luke for that matter. So sometimes you will get something that Mark says, which is a little bit more prosaic. Like in Mark, there are many who are first, who will be last. And there are Matthew, in one of his versions of that, he says, and the first will be last and the last will be first. He can neaten these things up into these really nice kind of parallel kind of phrases. So yeah, I think a lot of it is because Matthew has a good eye for these things, and sometimes he will double up. And I just think it's a natural thing that you get in rewriting of source material. It'd be surprising if they didn't do it.
Well, there's no doubt that you have doublets that are not explained by multiple sources. There's no question about that. The issue is, Matthew doubles up on the healing of the blind men, for example, right, and so on. But in the cases of these sayings, the ones that I'm using, these cases, Matthew is always more primitive than the Marcan version. Now, you can cleverly attribute that to his being a better author and being more trenchant in the way he expresses himself, and I wouldn't even doubt that in some cases. But to think that in no case is Mark more primitive than the non-Marcan doublets and non-doublets in Matthew is a problem for me. That's all I would say.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, primitivity is in the eye of the beholder, of course. But one of the things that I think we do know, and this is where I will concede at least part of the point. When in Matthew 24, you get this eschatological discourse, which is largely based on Mark 13.
Yeah.
It's fascinating that there are some parallels in Matthew 24, which are closer to 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, which everybody has agreed 1 Thessalonians is earlier than Mark and Matthew. So we do there have Matthew reprimitivizing Mark. That's a horrible word. Is that a real word? Reprimitivizing. Anyway, making look more primitive Mark. And so we can see that going on there. You've arguably got the same thing happening when you get Luke's Eucharistic passage, where you have significant parallels between Luke and 1 Corinthians over against Mark. Everybody thinks 1 Corinthians is earlier than Mark, me included. So there, Luke is reprimitivizing, if you like. So you do have that as a phenomenon. There's no doubt that kind of thing's going to be around. But the question is whether one wants to elevate that kind of phenomena to an overarching source hypothesis. That's where I get really kind of twitchy about it, because usually speaking, when you get down to looking to see whether the alleged greater primitivity really is greater primitivity, usually I think there's a perfectly good explanation for it, an explanation that you can find parallels to Matthew doing elsewhere. So Matthew's, one of the joys about Matthew is he's quite predictable. One of the things about Luke is he's not so predictable. He's predictably unpredictable. But Matthew, you can guess what he's going to do, a lot of the time. And that's where I think some of that stuff comes from. But yeah, of course, it's not robotic. They're not going to be every single case where Matthew has a parallel with Mark, it's going to look secondary. In every case where Luke's got a parallel with Matthew, it's going to look secondary. It's always going to be more complex than that.
Well said. Dr. MacDonald, obviously, you guys, that's where you get into the garden and really look at the weeds, because that's where I'm going to say you need to read their books, because at that point, we're going into where we would need like visuals and really breaking down some of these specific things and saying why you disagree and going from there. I guess, Dr. MacDonald, do you have any specific things you'd like to raise?
Well, I think Mark Goodacre and I are going to agree that we want you to buy the books. So on that, we're going to agree. I guess the only, then there was a more important thing I was going to say that has escaped me.
Maybe while you're thinking of that point, I'm not too bothered if people don't buy my books. You can do it for free by going to my website, and there's a ton of free stuff there, so you can start there if you like. And one of my books is available in toto for free on the internet, The Synoptic Problem: A Way Through the Maze, plus my podcast. Gosh, I'm sorry, Derek, I'm plugging away here, but also the podcast is all available totally for free. So these are hard times, and I worry thinking about people spending money on academic New Testament scholarship, especially when you can get at least a lot of my stuff without having to spend any money. That makes me very happy. The most important thing is that we're engaging our minds and we're thinking about important issues in serious ways.
Well, in fact, that reminds me another place that I agree with you, Mark. The two synopses that I'm working on now, I'm hoping to make available free as PDFs, and I'm almost done with it. And if I might just plug it a little, the first synopsis is of 4 synoptic gospels, and it begins and privileges my reconstruction of Q. So the columns are chronologically organized from the logo of Jesus, or Q plus, to Mark, to Matthew, to Luke. The second synopsis attempts to stratify the Gospel of John into its 3 compositional layers and then to compare them and to argue that the earliest one was an imitation of the Bacchae. So that should be available, I think, fairly soon. And that also should be available free as a PDF.
I, as the prophet of MythVision Podcast, if you don't get the material and don't get involved and active into this stuff, I'm kind of like Santa Claus. I know when you've been naughty or nice, okay? So you just need to check this stuff out for real. This is important to me, knowing this material. I obviously want to take 2021 to new lengths, especially in light of what we've had going on recent in America, as well as, like you said, the epidemic that this issue that we're dealing with COVID and everything. Like, I want to get more people aware of this stuff and have everyone on a common level, if you will, grab a hold of these complex ideas. And you guys, I think, did a pretty good job on breaking this stuff down for the layperson who is interested in these topics to at least pique their interest and to want to know more. And both of you guys are presenting free material. You're trying to get out there. Of course, this podcast right now is free.
Right.
So you can go in the description and you guys can access all the links to the websites to get the material. I really, really encourage you to do so for both of these gentlemen because they were kind enough to come. And I'm not going to say debate. I'm going to say conversate, if you will, because this was not really a debate, but these are the kind of discussions that I admire because it's not a UFC match. It's more what I would imagine would happen in the ancient world when philosophers would get together and want to discuss topics. They weren't yelling or throwing dung at each other. They were they were learning from each other, including, and they may not have come to conclusions agreeing. Like Dr. MacDonald probably doesn't agree at the end of the day that your hypothesis is correct, and you vice versa have disagreements. But this was one of the most beautiful, friendly discussions that I've seen in a minute, honestly. So,
I wish you could see my smile, Derek. I know my screen is frozen, but I'm smiling and thumbs up, and very much appreciate both you and Mark and the congeniality that I think we're feeling and sensing, and we trust that it's the Gospels that are the victors here, and that we can get people to take them seriously.
I definitely want to do that. I think next up we'll try and get someone who's a 2-document hypothesis proponent to come talk to Goodacre and you, Dr. MacDonald. I think this is just, we need to have more conversation between scholars and not just in text, because we have a new generation that are like me and younger that stick to audio and video, and they don't read like you guys used to read. And I say used to, like I'm already talking the good old days, Yeah. I gotta ask, Dr. Goodacre, I asked you about the mimetic connections Greek-wise. Do you think, and I don't know if you've read Dr. MacDonald's work on the Dionysian Gospel, what are your thoughts? Do you think that there is a Dionysian connection to
So I suppose the question is whether there's a direct connection, whether you can draw a direct line or not. And it's a little bit like my answer with the Homeric question. I think that what Professor MacDonald has done so well is open up our eyes and our ears to the broader Greco-Roman literary context in which the Gospels were born. And that's really, really important. So I'm going to punt on it for now and give myself more time to think about it.
Dude, you're a wise man. I'm telling you. I love it because I'm amateur reading this material and I'm going, he makes so much sense. I mean, like, for me, because but then again, he's also quoting the scholars in the book, and he's mentioning how they're not wanting to go to genetic connection. They're definitely wanting to say it's in the air, the aroma. Right. You can smell it, but we're not trying to say they had a baby. And I think that I heard a baby cry when I was reading the book. So, but yeah. Anyway, would you guys like to say a few complimentary things before we get off of here?
I'll just happily say that I do agree with you on the importance of engaging in different media. I think a lot of my colleagues are still very texty. And I always find that kind of surprising because personally, I find writing difficult. I mean, writing gets a little easier as you get older and get more used to it, but it's still hard. Whereas talking, I personally find much easier than writing. So I think I'm with those people of the younger generation who actually want to engage with one another. I'm always astonished when I have colleagues who get really excited about going on sabbatical. I go, well, what are you going to do? They're going to be, I'm writing a book. And I said, well, that sounds awful. I mean, wouldn't you rather be in the classroom? Being in the classroom is so much easier than writing a book. Anyway, so I just agree with you on that, Derek, and want to say thank you for what you're doing on the podcast. It's been fun.
Derek, thank you. And Mark, thank you for your generous spirit. I want you to greet Jennifer Knust, your new colleague, for me.
Sure.
And you can tell her that I put the pericope adulterae in Q. So that'll give us something else.
Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, cool.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you saw it yourself. I mean, this was not a battle. This was a very friendly, educating, scholarly discussion on the topic of to Q or not to Q. You tell me in the comment section. Let me know who you think has, I guess you'd say, a better proposition. Who do you agree with more? Do you think the Farrer hypothesis or the Papias Q plus hypothesis? Which one's closer to the truth in your own eyes? I'd like to hear that. Don't forget to hit that like button. Check out the material for these gentlemen down in the description. And never forget, we are
MythVision.
MythVision.